Welcome back to Worldview. Now, the U.S. Congress recently hit a new low in polling as the Gallup organization tracked their approval rating with just 10% of the American public feeling they do a good job. Now, that ranks them just behind head lice and just ahead of cockroaches. Now, to the current obsession they have on limiting women's reproductive freedoms and attempts to torpedo any type of immigration reform has to have had a dejecting effect on congressional staff workers. Well, today we have just the person to talk about that. Several weeks ago, Gale joined us here on the show to discuss her role as the Dear Abby of Capitol Hill staffers. We talked then of an environment where 535 members of the House and Senate, each with large staffs, also face everything from office politics to trying to build across-the-aisle romances and trying to advance their career. Rebecca writes the Hill Navigator column, which is a must-read for Capitol Hill staffers, and she's a contributing editor to Roll Call. Rebecca Gale, welcome back to Worldview.
Thanks so much for having me.
Oh, it's great to have you here. Now, before we get into the current issues, you wrote a column that appeared this week on staff marginalization and how to know when you're either on the way out the door or up, and it was a bit of an eye-opener. I'd love to know how that became a column, because as one who has risen and fallen inside of an office political environment, I'm certain it's huge in any office, let alone a political one. So what tips can you give, and how do you wake people up so they're more aware of the chances of them being marginalized?
Well, Hill Navigator is generated from questions from readers. Essentially, a reader will write in a question about something happening in their office, and I will take the time to answer it. This particular question was somebody who felt that their job titles and their responsibilities at work were being given to somebody else, and how could they handle it? And my advice to them was, whenever you switch responsibilities, whether you're getting more or you're getting fewer or any change that's happening, you really need to speak with your boss. In this case, it was the chief of staff I recommended. Sort of have a conversation, see what this means for you. And maybe this is a chance for you actually to expand your responsibilities. Maybe this is an opportunity for you to say what it is you want to get out of the office and how they can better utilize you. The other thing I really did was I cautioned this person against taking out their anger on the new staffer that was basically coming up into their position. I said, they may seem to be an easier target, but their ambition isn't actually what's hurting you. What's hurting you is the lack of communication between you and your boss. And it's not necessarily even a bad thing. It's possible that, the rising tide in an office can lift more boats. And the staffer that's getting promoted underneath you could mean a promotion for you as well. It does not necessarily mean you're being shown the door.
Good advice. Good advice. I want to shift gears a little bit and talk a little bit about what it's like to work as a staffer in this current rather strained and difficult political environment. I mean, we hear the speaker constantly deflect all criticism with the phrase, "I'm all about jobs, jobs, jobs," before then lobbing a rhetorical grenade down Pennsylvania Avenue at the White House. And to see this Congress scheduling for the 37th time a vote to repeal Obamacare, or trying to ban abortion at the 20-week thing, which seems a little bit strange, or members of Congress calling Mexican immigrants wetbacks or threatening to veto immigration reform, let's take these one at a time. What is happening with the Obamacare fixation? And do staffers not cringe when this comes up over and over again? What type of letters do you get from them?
I can't speak for all of the staffers on policy issues, but I do think that there are a lot of people in the House of Representatives who want to use their positions to sort of have a platform and have a megaphone to sort of amplify what they think is the message that resonates either with them or their district. I mean, the president's been very clear he's going to veto these pieces of legislation. The Senate has been very clear they're not going to even take these things up. So whenever the House is passing something like you had mentioned, what's happening is they're doing that to sort of show where they stand on these issues without actually trying to legislate further, in a sense, because there's no conversations about how this is going to get done. For legislation to pass, it requires the Senate and it requires the president. And these things aren't happening with the topics you're talking about. Immigration reform may be the one exception. I'm not an immigration expert, but I do know there's lots of conversations going on. There's a big play for this voting bloc. There's a huge Hispanic population in our country is growing rapidly, and these are going to be active voters, active citizen participants, and both parties really want to make a play to get these voters on their side. So I think immigration reform is the one place where you may actually see some legislation happening.
But I want to get back to the issue of the staff, because, I mean, I would imagine that, you know, if you're working for a member of Congress and you've got these issues going on where you've just said, you know, they're not going to be taken up by the Senate, they're not going to be signed by the president. So the question becomes, why bother? Is this just a drinking of the Kool-Aid issue? Or do they ever want to win an election again? How do the staff keep their heads up during all of this?
Well, a lot of staff really believe in what they're doing, and one of the things I've talked about in my column several times is it's very important to have a boss in an office that believes in you, and in return, you should believe in them and their mission. So you have to think a lot of the staff who are taking this up for their boss do believe in what they're doing and feel some, you know, value add of what it is that they're getting from this position. And sometimes they don't. Capitol Hill has a high turnover rate. It's not for everybody. It's a very tough job. The hours are very long and demanding. So, you know, I said that in my column before, if you do not love working on Capitol Hill, it might not be the position for you. But a lot of people who are there love it and wouldn't change it for anything.
We're speaking with Rebecca Gale. She writes the Hill Navigator column for Roll Call magazine on Worldview with Dennis Campbell. Now, Rebecca, demographics don't lie. How do these mostly second and third generation immigrant members of Congress themselves balance the rhetoric against immigration and the electoral reality? I mean, do staff ever bring these issues up, and do they write anything to you for Hill Navigator about, gosh, I mean, the seeming hypocrisy of it all?
I think that the balance between a member of Congress's personal beliefs and their background and the way that they and their party want to vote is something that every office will struggle with. Every individual staffer, every member, their own life has contradictions in it. That's who we are as people. That's very natural to have. It's how you handle it. It's having this, you know, I think I told people before in my column, you know, members aren't perfect either. These are people who have come to elected office, and they've done so through a variety of ways. People have changed their minds on positions. They've taken different stances, and what works in someone's home state doesn't necessarily always work in Washington, D.C. And that's one of the bitter realities for people who have come up through local politics and are used to getting things done a certain way. There's a certain type of politicking that is very natural and local to where they're from. But in Washington, D.C., it's a very different animal. And I think those contradictions are normal and they're common, but I also think having a good head about you and sort of realizing what it is that's most important to you and your office is one of the key differences between an office that is successful at both their message, getting reelected, and being an effective legislator from one that isn't.
Well, great stuff. I mean, I just I try to imagine what it's like sitting in your chair, listening to people, because you probably have to keep your ear pretty close to the ground. And I try to think if your office is out there dispensing Valium and alcoholic beverages, because I just cannot imagine being a Hill staffer with all of these issues bouncing around. Have you ever seen it this bad? And if so, I mean, how do you bring these up in the mail? You've got to be getting mail where people are saying, gosh, what do I do, just based on the fact that things seem to be so dysfunctional. And how do you bring this up in a column?
I think partisan politics has always been in Congress. I don't think it's particularly different now than it was years ago. I think the methods in which people disseminate their message have changed. I think we live in a very fast time now. You can put a message on Twitter and Facebook. It can be out in moments. It used to be you had to write a press release and then send that out, and even email or fax machine, for people who remember when press releases came that way, that required a different level of, you couldn't just hit send. You had to really put something together and put it out. And, you know, the newspapers were on a different deadline than they are now. So I think that's potentially changed. But in general, Congress has always been political and always been partisan. There's always been warring factions. I mean, they had a government shutdown. You know, before they've had arguments, they tried to impeach the president before, and they succeeded. So there's been multiple examples where, you know, the Republicans, Democrats have been at odds with one another, and things still get done. They just happen at a pace that it's different for most people to be used to.
Well, Rebecca, we'll be watching as always. Thanks for taking the time to join us today.
My pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
We've been speaking with Rebecca Gale of Roll Call and Congressional Quarterly. She writes the weekly advice Hill Navigator column for Roll Call and is author of the book Trying, published by Boxfire Press. You're watching Worldview with Dennis Campbell. Stay right here.